The Feast of Tabernacles is the last feast that we have in the Hebrew calendar, and it reminds us that Christ is our dwelling King. Now, Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, came 5 days after the Day of Atonement, and it lasted for 7 days. And Israel was commanded to live in booths, Sukkots, temporary shelters made of branches. And this reminded them of their journey in the wilderness when God provided food, water, and shelter. It was also called the Feast of the Ingathering, and you can find that in Exodus 22, verses 16, where there was celebration celebrating the final harvest of the year. So Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, was both memorial of God's provision in the past and also a prophecy of God's future promise of joy and dwelling. So the theological themes that come through the Sukkot or the Feast of Tabernacles is that God dwells with his people. And in the wilderness, God's presence filled the tabernacle. And you can see that in Exodus 34 to verse 38. And the booths reminded Israel that God was their shelter and not the structures that they built. Does that remind you of anything now in this modern day time? The Feast of Tabernacles also was joy and celebration. So it was the most joyful feast out of the 7. And this is where people rejoiced in God's provision, which you see in Deuteronomy 16, 14 to 15. And also Nehemiah talks about this, saying that joy was very great when they were restored from this feast. And you can find that Nehemiah 8 and verses 17. So we see the Israelites at this point during the feast that they are living in tents, a pilgrimage. And the temporary shelters reminded Israel that this world was not their permanent home. And you see that in Hebrews 11, verse 13, that actually the Sukkots point to the eternal dwelling when God is preparing his people, because he's going to be coming back, right? And we're going to be going to the eternal dwelling. So we also see that Christ's fulfillment through this feast. We see the incarnation. We see that Jesus is God's presence living among us. And John 1:14 says, the word became flesh and dwelt, tabernacled among us. And then we also see living water. On the last day of Sukkot, what the priest would do was pour water at the altar, and Jesus declared, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. And you find that in John 7:37 to 38. We also see a theme of the light of the world. And it was during Sukkot that giant lamps lit Jerusalem. And Jesus declared, I am the light of the world. And you find that in John 8:12. So what is the future fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot? Well, if we go to Revelations 21:3, it says, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them and they will be his people. So tabernacles point to the eternity when God will dwell with us forever. So what is the doctrine truth of this? So the truth really is that we see incarnation here. We see that God came down to dwell with us in Jesus. We see the sanctification. We see that the Spirit makes us God's temple now, which we see in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 6:19. We also see the glorification, that actually one day God himself will tabernacle with his people. We see that in Revelations 21:3 to 4. We also see eschatology, which is the end times. We see that the tabernacle is the feast of joy that looks forward to the final harvest and eternal kingdom. So what does that mean for us today living in living tabernacle today? What does that look like if we were living in that feast? What's the application of that? And I believe that it's us reminding ourselves that God is our shelter. That Psalms 91 to 1 to 2 says, trust him more than material security. He covers us under his wings. That's a daily reminder that we can take, that we must trust the Lord and not these material things. And actually that we can rejoice in his provision. Sukkot, the day of the Feast of Tabernacles, was it was full of joy, that event. And do we live in gratitude and celebration in Christ, or are we just going on with our mundane days and not even giving Christ a second thought? Are we living as pilgrims? We're reminded not to settle too deeply into this world, that our true home is with Christ in eternity, which you can find in Philippians 3 verse 20. So we can look forward to the kingdom. And every feast of Tabernacle, Shavuot, points us to the coming day when God will dwell with his people forever. So what can you take home, from this feast? You can take home that the booths, the tabernacles, the Sukkots, they're God's, it's God our shelter. The water is Jesus is our living water. And then the light, that Jesus is our light. And our joy is in God's eternal kingdom. So when we're thinking about those key points, the tabernacle really shouts at us. It tells us that God has provided, that God is present and he will dwell with us forever. And that is something to remember, and it's something to celebrate. So God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. And I'll see you in eternity when that day comes. But yeah, be happy, be blessed.